Welcome to this, the first Pro Bono Economics webinar. My name's Gus O'Donnell. I was former Cabinet Secretary, but for the importance for today, Chair of Pro Bono Economics. Really delighted to be here with two wonderful guests I'll introduce in a minute. So our topic is well-being in the time of coronavirus. But first of all, let me tell you a little bit about Pro Bono Economics. Our role is to help charities understand their impact and to help them measure that impact. And increasingly, we found that using well-being as a kind of common currency has worked very well for helping charities show their multiple impact in the social, economic, and all spheres, basically. In terms of COVID and Pro Bono Economics, we have adjusted ourselves to this new world, as everybody has had to. First of all, we've introduced a fast-track volunteering program, because we've had a lot of charities coming to us wanting some very quick help in basic issues about data, about financing and the like, possibly just about use of spreadsheets, very simple things. So we were going to try and help them there, but if you know people that want to get involved in that fast track program, either as volunteers or using it, great. Secondly, for the sector as a whole, we are running a charity tracker survey, basically looking at the impact as measured by you, charities, on the sector. What we found so far is the lockdown rules, the biggest impact they've had is on stopping charities being able to deliver their services. Seems obvious, but actually a number of people have thought it's all about fundraising, but it's that first bit that actually charities have found more important. And secondly, of course, fundraising is massive as well. So those two big things. What I would say to those working for charities here, it's really important that you get your voice heard in terms of how we come out of this lockdown, both in terms of timing and phasing, because at the moment, it's to be honest, very much dominated by politics, health issues, but actually there are economic issues, there are social sector issues, which are very important, which need to be taken into account. Right, enough from me. So on to our distinguished guests. We have two, Professor Lord Richard Lau, and a very close friend, happiness guru to all, and me. I have here his, Can We Be Happier? And indeed, The Origins of Happiness. So plenty of reading material for the lockdown for me. He is also a distinguished labour economist, founder of the Centre for Economic Performance at LSE. And also Professor Carol Proper, who is a Professor of Economics at Imperial, which has been quite a centre for this whole episode. Currently President of the Royal Economic Society, Fellow of the British Academy and the American National Academy of Medicine. So, enough from me. I'm going to hand over first to Richard to basically give us the perspective. Richard, how can well-being be applied to government policy in general and to this COVID episode in particular?
Well, thank you. Hello, everybody. I want to just make 4 points. First, you made the point. If you've got lots of effects of a policy, it's very difficult for anybody to judge whether the policy is good or bad, unless they can somehow get a combined effect of all the policies in terms of a single a common currency. So if you take COVID policy affects the number of deaths, it affects the national income, unemployment, mental health, air quality, social cohesion, many of these things. We can forecast those outcomes, but then how do we value them in order to compare the importance of one with another? We've got to have a common currency, and that is well-being. So second, what is the best measure of well-being that we are going to use? We, all of us, I think, now use the measure of how satisfied you are with your life. Do you feel your life is good or not? On a scale of 0 to 10, 0, very dissatisfied, 10, extremely dissatisfied, extremely satisfied. So once we've got the measure established, we can then find out what determines it. And of course, we know from the new science of well-being a huge amount about what the effects of different experiences are in terms of their quantitative effect on well-being. So, for example, if you're unemployed, it reduces your well-being by 0.7 points out of the 0 to 10 scale. Equally, as it happens, if you're diagnosed for depression and anxiety, it reduces your well-being by 0.7 points, and so on for all the other different effects. And so then when we come to, of course, add them up, it's very important how long these effects last. Because suppose that COVID leads a person to be unemployed for a year, well, that's a loss of 0.7 years of well-being. But if it's only, the person's only unemployed for half a year, then it's obviously a smaller loss. It's 0.35 years of well-being. So we're taking years of well-being as the thing we're going to measure. And we like to have a little acronym, so we call it WellBeers. So this is about how we can use well-being years or WellBeers as the measure of the value of anything we're talking about. Last point on the measurement, of course, we've got to find a way of incorporating the end of life as well as the quality of life. And what we know is that the average person experiences 7.5 well-bees per year. That's their average score in well-being. So it's quite straightforward how you deal with length of life. You just take away 7.5 times however many years of life are lost. And that, when we apply it to the COVID decisions, we tried to look at what would be the arguments for coming out of the lockdown and different dates over the course of the year. We found that because the economic damage is increasing month by month, it eventually overwhelms the saving of deaths by continuing the lockdown. And so we found, on the basis of our assumptions, that the appropriate time to phase out the lockdown was around the month of June. But that's more an illustration of the method than a sort of absolutely decisive recommendation. So lastly, I just want to say, it's actually, COVID is about the most difficult thing to apply our method to. Most of the things that we want to talk about when we think about policy, think about what the third sector is doing, thinking about government policy, spending on health, education, social care, and so on, is very easy, much easier than COVID to analyze in terms of well-being. That's what we want to see happening. We put out a report for the upcoming spending review, and Gus was another co-chair of that, from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Wellbeing Economics. And it just stressed, I just end with this phrase, it stressed the huge importance of social infrastructure compared with physical infrastructure. And I think that's probably what most of the third sector is about, building the social infrastructure. So I think that if we adopt the wellbeing approach, we've got a scientific tool which will also lead to really rather different priorities for our society.
Richard, thank you very much. Carol, over to you. So one thing that struck me was this is very unusual. If you compare the last crisis I went through when I was in government, global financial crisis, very much an economic crisis. Here we have a crisis which is both a health shock and an economic shock. What do you think that means for how we should analyse this?
Thank you, Gus. Yes, as you say, this is kind of unusual in the sense that obviously initially everyone was concerned with the health shock, treating patients immediately, reorganising the NHS and other services so that we could do that. And that's had immediate health impacts as well on people who are not got COVID. So we've seen this huge drop in A&E attendances, some of which may be not necessary, but some of which are for people with, for example, suspected heart attacks. And we've also seen incredible amounts of deferred treatment. So any treatment that's not emergency has had to be stopped. And that includes people with diseases like cancers. It's not just hips, knees, and cataract operations that have been put off. So that you can see this huge wall, if you like, of unmet health need that is rising from the need to address the health part of it. But as you say, the other side of this is because it's a pandemic and because it's contagious, we've had to deal with the economic shock of locking down an economy incredibly fast and locking down the global economy. And I think one of those things that's done is really exposed the existing inequality fault lines that were already there. But I think COVID has made them much sharper, both within the UK context and the global context. Thinking about the UK, the people who are hit, and this relates to kind of well-being and going forward, are the young in terms of their lack of schooling. Those people who are entering the labour market in a recession, we know that that's not good, not just for your immediate 6 or 8 months of unemployment, but your whole trajectory, particularly if you're low skilled. It hurts young workers. They're more likely to have lost their jobs. We saw the Resolution Foundation's report earlier this week. They're more likely to be in the gig economy. They're more likely to be in unstable work. And within that group, there are some groups of young who are relatively protected by having family wealth and family resources, but it's most likely to hit the less skilled and those who live in certain places. You can already see there's the idea of, in the US, of deaths of despair, people whose well-being is so low that they are committing suicide essentially because the places they live in offer no hope. And I think that's one of the economic consequences we can see. So I think then on top of that, importantly, the economic shock itself then has further health consequences. So we know that being born in a recession is not good for your whole lifetime trajectory of outcomes. We know also that recessions, whilst they may be good in terms of overall mortality from things like pollution or traffic accidents or accidents at work, because there's just less of them, we know that recessions are associated with rises in mental health increases and rises in chronic health. And we did some work which was around the global financial crash period. And we found that the effect of the global financial crash, which was much smaller in terms of employment drop, was quite large, with approximately nearly under 1 million people estimated to be suffering from chronic health conditions, many of which may go on for many years. And again, in terms of well-being, it's not just 1 year's effects, it's many years. That in turn is going to have an implication for the future demand for healthcare and services around healthcare. So I think in sum, we've kind of got what you might call a perfect storm, both a health crisis and an economic crisis.
Thanks, Carol. And if I might add my own perspective, looking at this from the point of view of what it would have been like if I'd been in government, it strikes me that this crisis is multifaceted. And it is quite unusual in that you look at, say, the global financial crisis, then exogenous shocks in the financial sector, you know, things happening in subprime somewhere result in our economy going badly. And, you know, we have to react to that in various ways. This time round, it's actually been, you know, a virus, completely sort of exogenous shock, as it were. But the government responding to it, actually forcing a recession. So it's government that's actually created, if you like, this recession by stopping us spending and all the rest of it for good reason. And government can let go of that and spending can come back up. Those two things will obviously mean GDP falls dramatically, much more than it has before, ever, for, you know, hundreds of years, and jumps back up. But it actually, that won't be a very good guide to what's really going on, in my view. I mean, this recovery as we go to it it will be quite a jobs poor recovery, I think, because we have already pushed the cost of capital down dramatically. Interest rates zero and are going to stay zero for a very long time. If you're employing someone now, you're going to have to give them a lot more space. There's going to be all sorts of issues about, the cost of labour being higher. So people are going to be thinking more about, can we do away with these jobs? So I think all the points you made, Carol, about the problems of a recession and the problems of people who graduate, particularly the young, coming up to a job market now, when actually that job market may be thinking, excuse me, more about how do I stop employing so many people because they're very expensive. So there's going to be some issues there. I think from a government point of view, what we've seen is this emphasis on the direct impact of COVID has meant that we've had the direct medical work being shown on the press conferences every day, number of deaths in hospitals, leaving out sort of care homes, the direct effects, not the indirect effects that you mentioned, Carol, about other things that just aren't happening. So it's visible in the immediate that the politicians have concentrated on, and it's been dominated by the medical science. I hope in the next stage, we get a chance to put social back in front of science, and we have a bit of social science that actually looks at and brings all these things together, which is where we come back to the whole concept of well-being. Final point from me, what strikes me in comparison with the global financial crisis, I remember being with Gordon Brown during that crisis, and we brought the world together. Gordon Brown's Saving the World, brought the world together at the G20, which was held in the Excel Centre, which is now the Nightingale Hospital, which I think is rather empty. And that was an effective means of the world working together to try and solve a common problem. And, yes, we were luckier. We had President Obama, who was very cooperative. We worked well with our European counterparts. Those things probably are much more difficult now. But it was interesting that we managed to stop the world going down this protectionist route. And you look at where we are now, we've got everyone hanging on to their own PPE. We'll have a big issue if we do develop an effective vaccine as to whether it can be spread around the world, or does everyone produce it for themselves, which I think would be quite difficult. I know that Richard and I actually, when we looked at that other challenge, which to me requires big behavior change, namely climate change, and we looked at this with a kind of well-being hat on, and we said, look, the solutions to these big global problems, coronavirus, it's a virus, it's spread around the world. Climate change, it's a worldwide problem, is for the world to cooperate. And we put forward a program called the Global Apollo Program, which was the idea of all of the world's scientists thinking about, just as American scientists had in the Apollo program 10 years to get a man on the moon, all the world scientists spending 10 years trying to get clean energy cheaper than fossil fuel energy. And then suddenly the market takes over. Similarly, now you'd think in the COVID period, we'd be trying to get all the world scientists to come together and think about how to do vaccines, how to do treatments, and all these other possibilities that we know are out there, and to coordinate and cooperate in terms of bringing them together. Anyway, those are thoughts I thought I'd throw in. Richard, one of the big set of issues that was applied to us afterwards was one of the questions that came in advance was, if you are applying a well-being objective, how would the world be different in the future? What would you say to that?
Well, I think if we think about, let's think about government policy first. If you think about government policy, we would be judging the way the Treasury spends its money by its impact on the quality of people's lives. And if you think of what difference it would make to people's lives to have some decent psychological support for their children who had mental health problems, to have support for their parents, proper social care support for their parents, and so on. you can imagine quite big numbers, can't you? And I mean, we can put some numbers on, but I think even if you just think about it, you can imagine some big numbers. If you asked, what would be the effect of cutting down the journey time from London to Birmingham by 20 minutes at a cost of, say 50 billion, which would pay for nearly half the health service for a year, you'd be hard put to it to think of the impact of that on the well-being of people of this country being anything like as great as dealing with what I called the social infrastructure earlier on. So I think we should be seeing much more attention, and the Treasury should be paying more attention when it does its evaluation, not to capital projects, but to current expenditure. As far as society is concerned, I mean, I really hope that this experience of good neighborliness, which is so wonderful to have around us, this sense of fellow feeling, which has come back as I remember it as a youngster in the war. I think we need to, and I think we've got a good chance of capturing that on a permanent basis, because people are seeing what a different kind of feeling it is to live in a world where people take more care of each other. So I'm a co-founder of something called Action for Happiness, which is a movement of people who pledge to try and create as much happiness in the world as they can. And I really hope that the kind of culture that we're trying to produce there, of people choosing as their goal not to increase the climb of the greasy pole, but to do something useful for society. I think if that could become much more embedded in our schools, that's what the well-being in schools movement is centered on, giving people a sense of purpose and something they can contribute outside themselves rather than excessive self-absorption. We could get more attention to the well-being of workers at work. It's a big part of life. We're seeing already some movement in business. I think that will change. I think, as you hinted, there will be this feeling of, let's think about whose job really matters. This idea of key workers is really quite interesting. It's really struck people that actually we can get along pretty well without a lot of the financial activities which absorb so much of the talent of the country. But we can't get along without doctors and people who care for mental health and so on. Teachers, all of these are seen now as key workers. And I think hopefully that will also be a feature of the future. I don't mean just that the public sector is good, but that we have a different sense of what is a valuable job and what isn't.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, one of my bugbears with the messaging and all of this is that we keep going on about social distancing. And I've always thought it would be much better if we talked about physical distancing and social togetherness, because actually we're trying to get this community spirit going.
Exactly.
But Carol, in terms of the future for the health and care service, what do you think are the things we should be concentrating on?
I think I would echo something that Richard just mentioned, which is the health of workers. I think one of the things we've seen in this COVID epidemic, and it's been very obvious, is that NHS doctors and politicians have not always been very careful about how they've talked about the staff who work in the NHS. Matt Hancock's comment about misuse of PPE, when I know that individual clinicians have been trying, spending all their time trying to get PPE for their staff and themselves, where nurses have not been wearing it simply because it doesn't exist, but they still care for their patients, is not an appropriate way to treat individuals who are doing their best to serve patients and their general community. So I think starting from this position of well-being of workers in the healthcare sector, and by the healthcare sector, I don't just mean the NHS, but we certainly have a problem within the NHS. We know that we're 50,000 nurses down already before we went into this crisis. On top of that, we've got Brexit. And on top of that, I think nurses in Germany and Bulgaria and Indonesia are going to be looking at Britain and thinking, how many people were sacrificed by a government that didn't care? So I think we have a real issue. We're also going to have a lot of senior clinicians who are close to retirement who are thinking, well, I'm doing this now, but I've been working my socks off and, you know, risking my life and doing things I didn't expect to do, like trying to find PPE equipment, who are also going to be thinking about exiting the NHS. So I think we're going to have a big staffing shortage. And in order to address that, we need to be thinking about pay, conditions, and well-being. But more to the point, we also need to be thinking about our care sector. Our care sector is heavily staffed by individuals from BME heritage or immigrants to Britain who are often not valued, who work extremely long hours for extremely low pay. And it's clear that, you know, that sector has been ignored. We need to build back better. We need to think about that sector, incredibly important. We need to be thinking about raising the skill sets and raising the financial rewards to people in that sector.
Thanks, Carol. We've had another set of questions in about the practicalities of how one might apply a wellbeing approach in a particular charity. And I'd like to bring in here our chief economist who's with us from Pro Bono Economics, Jon Franklin. John, you know, Richard has talked about this, using wellbeing as a common currency. In reality, is this feasible for a charity, particularly one that's kind of struggling at the moment? How can they make this real, and what are the advantages to them of doing that?
So I think one of the advantages of the wellbeing approach is actually it's very pragmatic. It's a very practical way of measuring the impact of different interventions. The ONS did Office of National Statistics did a very good effort at reviewing what is the right way of measuring wellbeing. And they came up with a suggestion of 4 key questions, of which the life satisfaction question, so, all things considered, how would you rate your life satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 10, is one that's being picked up fairly consistently across a lot of government data sets and by a lot of people who want to measure well-being. So actually, if you want as an organization to be measuring well-being, adopting that one single question as part of the measurement and evaluation frameworks that a lot of charities already have in place, a lot of the questionnaires that are already issued to the people they're working with, add that one question and you're in a pretty good place to be able to start measuring the impact you're having on well-being. So I think that's the first thing I'd say is it is a genuinely kind of practical, pragmatic approach to measuring impact. In terms of the advantages of that for charities, I think it very much reflects what Richard has already outlined in terms of firstly giving it a more complete measure of the outcomes and the impact that charities are having. So traditional economic evaluations of charity interventions are very good at picking up certain types of outcomes, but not very good at picking up others. So if you use a mental health intervention as an example, a typical economic evaluation of a mental health intervention will pick up the fact that it might increase the likelihood that somebody will be in employment. It might reduce the amount of time they spent on absence or sick leave. But generally speaking, they massively ignore, I guess, the real fundamental reason for giving mental health support, which is helping somebody to feel better and improve their quality of life. Whereas a well-being approach is far more holistic and does a much better job of capturing all that. And the other advantage is, again, to go back to Richard's point earlier, it allows charities and funders of charities to compare across different types of interventions, different types of program, and think about where they can get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of the amount of money spent for improving the quality of life of the beneficiaries they're working with. Because it gives that single currency that is more consistent, that has fewer gaps when you compare across different types of interventions, it's a much stronger candidate for helping people to do that.
Thanks very much, John. Another question that's come in is in general about the role of technology. So all of us, the fact that we're here all on Zoom, interacting, has had a big impact during this crisis. So a lot of people who've never used this sort of technology before are using it. A lot more people will be working from home. That may be a sustainable thing. So, and is technology part of the answer to this, or is it part of the problem? Has it created difficulties? So where would you be on this? Richard, do you have any strong views about this? Is technology in general good or bad for well-being? That's the question.
Well, I'm not sure it's a useful question. I mean, the development of technology is the expression of human creativity. It will go on forever. So I'm not in favor of sort of saying whether one's pro or con. We have to talk about particular technologies. I saw a very interesting paper recently about which technologies had done the most to raise, as this was done, in terms of the sort of the well-being of the people in a way that's not measured in the GNP. And the thing became much the biggest was search. I mean, the fact that the world's knowledge is now open to every citizen of the world on the press of a button is completely extraordinary and hugely positive. So that's an example of the biggest single step forward which technology, the tech sector, has done for the world, without any doubt, to me. The more questionable one, of course, is social media. And we do know from a number of studies that Facebook is making young people more anxious. You can see it in the time series that just as membership of Facebook goes up, so the number of people who say, I feel left out goes up. Now, isn't that extraordinary? It was meant to bring them in, but they feel left out because everybody is showing off. So I think that going back to what I was saying about culture, social media have worked in a way contrary to the improvement of culture that I was hoping to see, which was where people were less self-absorbed. It's led to more concern with your impression that you're making in the world and less fellow feeling with other people, more competition. So it's a mixed picture, but I think you have to deal with each one on its own merits. We will, incidentally, of course, and people don't quite realize this. Most technologies have had very bad side effects, and the most obvious one is the car. I don't know if listeners know, but in 1930, the number of people killed by cars in Britain was 7,000. It's now 2,000, in spite of the fact that there are probably hundreds-fold more cars, because we've completely regulated the whole of that technology. We've regulated the car itself, we've regulated the use of the roads. Everything is regulated. And we will totally regulate the technology sector. We'll totally regulate social media. All of these things will get regulated.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Carol, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't think I want to speculate on whether technology is good or bad, but I do want to speculate a little bit on technology divide. Mm-hmm. So there are clearly some people for whom technology will, for example, make homeworking much easier. But there are other people who cannot homework. And I think it's important that when we think about technology, we think about the people who have access and easy access, and the people who don't have access and what that does to their lives. And the other thing is whether, returning to your point, Gus, I think in the immediate future, because capital is cheap and labor is expensive and technology can replace labor, I think those people who do not use technology so much in their jobs, but whose jobs can be replaced by technology, are in a very vulnerable short-term situation.
And a clear example of that will be that will show itself up in higher unemployment. And we're getting a number of questions in from people in the charitable sector saying, look, I mean, it's really a cri de coeur that we are facing increased demand for our resources. for the charitable sector at a time when we're less able to do things than ever. Is there anything that governments can do about this? Probably I should throw that at myself to start with, because I genuinely think there is. I genuinely think when I was there, government was starting to think about how to deal with civil society in a positive way. In that you want it to be creative, you don't want it to be dealt with by a centralized bureaucracy. You want to think about, as I think the phrase Richard used and Andy Haldane and I have been using in some work we've been doing, about building social infrastructure, building social capital. And the problem with social capital is if you don't use it, it goes away. And can you get the state to help in that process? And now will be a very good time to do it. One of the things I'm thinking about very much is what will happen with this crisis is a big increase in youth unemployment. As Carol mentioned, the young are seriously more adversely affected economically than this. They're 2.5 times more likely to be in a sector that's been closed down because of lockdown, according to the IFS. So are there things we can do to get young people involved in the third sector in that period where they're waiting for a job, but doing really serious work which builds on their skills, which makes them more employable for the future, at the same time as keeping them off being paid unemployment benefits and actually doing a productive job which helps society. Now that will show up quite much in helping and improving people's well-being overall. God knows what the overall impact on GDP is. I don't really care. But it would be quite a useful thing. And in terms of public finances, if we can get them off being recipients of benefits and actually developing skills, which mean they get back into work quicker and start paying taxes quicker, then from a Treasury point of view, this is quite attractive. And I certainly think that from a Treasury standpoint, these sorts of things would work. So I think that's where I'd see governments being able to help charities. Of course, the key for the charitable sector then is, can you offer real opportunities which develop people, which gives them real skills, which can then be used to help them move on through their careers? Because we've seen examples of this where people volunteer. The recent one where they asked for people for the NHS, 750,000 volunteers. I'm told there could have been a lot more if they hadn't closed the phone lines, but very few of them used. So I think this is a process that needs the third sector to work very carefully to understand how they can, what would be best for them, and how can they help in this process. And as I said right at the start, make their voice heard, because I think government there is an appetite now for a larger state to do more. You've seen this, for example, in Boris Johnson apparently thinking that obesity probably isn't a problem that should just be left alone, but maybe we should do something about it. Yes. And I think in general, you'll find governments thinking one of the lessons of this crisis is we did not spend enough on prevention, and protection against possible future outcomes. And that maybe the lesson is that it's much more expensive if you let these terrible things happen, and that actually preventing them is rather good. And if you wanted to look at something like the forthcoming obesity crisis, wouldn't it be better to prevent it than think about how do we deal with it when it happens? And what does a system of prevention really mean? And in terms of well-being, that will be thinking about how do we improve people's well-being by making it easier to lead active, enjoyable lives. So I think those sorts of things will work very well. Right, more questions. I will go to, we've got a lot of questions about, will we ever get politicians saying we'll be guided by the social science rather than by the science? Carol, do you think there's any way we can get them to treat social science in a similar way to proper science? Carol or Richard, whoever wants to come up with that.
And let me start as a passionate believer in both social science and indeed interdisciplinary studies. That I think clearly, you know, if you're talking about how to control a virus and you're talking about developing vaccines, you need scientists, and it's a good thing we have a lot of scientists in Britain. We do have an awful lot of people who now know on dinners about talking about R. I'm not sure whether that has improved our lives, but the people who do really know about R are needed. I think one of the problems in the current debate has been that the scientists have been portrayed as being A, unanimous, and B, having no uncertainty in their models. And this is clearly not true. No good scientist has no uncertainty in their models. So we've had quite a lot that just says, you know, this is A and this is how the scientists say it should be done. I know that that's not actually what most scientists would think. There's a lot more nuance, and there's a lot more uncertainty over even the scientific pronunciations on what R is or is not, for various reasons. But in terms of social sciences, I do think that it is clear to everyone now that this is an economic and social crisis, and not just a social crisis around the death of mainly elderly people. It's a social crisis, particularly around the young, particularly around the marginalized, particularly around healthcare workers and care home sector workers. And there is obviously a role, an important role. That's what social sciences know about. We know about political cohesion. We know about things like, you know, the influence of social media. So I think the role for social sciences will increase. I would hope that it partly increases by scientists saying, we just don't know about unlocking schools because we don't understand the behavioral responses of parents to that. We can model social distancing, we can model R, but what we don't know, the most important thing, is that most parents and many teachers may say, not on your life, we don't want this. Or that other groups may say, we do want this. And scientists don't have those things in their models. Social scientists do.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
I mean, as you know, Gus, economists do have a lot of influence in government, largely due to your period as head of the Government Economic Service. And this has led to many good things happening, often for reasons which are actually not the best reasons. For example, in 2004, NICE had recommended that everybody with depression or anxiety disorders should be offered evidence-based psychological therapy, and nothing at all happened. How did we get it to happen? By pointing out that if we did it, the amount of money saved on unemployment benefit and lost taxes would be as great as the amount of money spent on the psychological therapy. However, that is not a good reason for providing psychological therapy. The reason for providing psychological therapy is its impact on the quality of life, relative, of course, to the cost of achieving that. So what I think is the most striking thing that I've come across since I've been involved in this sort of thing is the effective role of economists and the ineffective role of psychologists. I mean, they have not found a way of influencing policy, and to a lesser degree of sociologists, in the way that economists have. And yet, if the well-being agenda is to have the impact we want, it entirely depends on a cooperative, multidisciplinary effort by economists working with psychologists and sociologists. That's what the well-being agenda is centered on. And I hope that the well-being movement, which we're all part of, will have the effect of getting psychology and sociology taken as seriously, not just in limited areas, but across the board as economics.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Add to that,
Carol, yeah.
add political science. I think political science is really important
Yeah, sure.
for
sure.
a well-being agenda, because we know that division in society along certain political lines is not good for well-being generally.
Sure.
Yes, completely take that. Now, we've got a section of a number of questions saying about, they're basically related to climate change. You know, how can the recovery be more climate change, be more green? Wouldn't this be a good for well-being? And why is it that we've been able to change behavior quite radically because of a virus, but the kind of relatively limited behavior changes that would be needed to make us greener have proved so difficult? Richard, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think it is quite interesting that COVID, which you might expect to be a distraction from climate change, may actually turn out to have helped climate change by making people feel that all sorts of things that everybody said could never be done can be done. And I think that a part of the resistance in the elite to doing what they should be doing on climate change is this feeling that, you know, you can't change things that much. And now we've got used to things being changed a huge amount. And I think this will play to the benefit of climate change. I mean, obviously the problem is it's further, an awful lot further ahead than COVID, which is again where the well-being methodology becomes very important, because if you follow some traditional economic methodology and you apply high discount rates, things that are going to happen in 50 years' time are pretty much unimportant, but they're hardly of any consequence. Whereas if you adopt the well-being approach, what you say is future generations matter as much as ours. There's no real reason to discount the well-being of future generations at all, or only by a minute amount because of uncertainty relative to ours. And so adopting the well-being perspective, you're thinking about people rather than, quote, economies, gets you into a very different frame of mind when you're approaching climate change. And I think that well-being movement is the necessary intellectual underpinnings for the climate change movement.
Carol, do you want to add to that?
I think I agree with that. I mean, and I also agree though, I think, you know, people do respond to things that are immediately in their face and not immediately in their face. But one of the things that a lockdown has done has shown people, all of us, I think, what it's like to live in an environment with fewer cars, less pollution, less noise, and hopefully we'll all value that more.
That would be nice. I always say that we will value hugs more. They don't really show up in GDP very much, but it's one of the things that a lot of us are missing. Another batch of questions about education and the young. Can you measure well-being in people under 12, under 18? What does this mean for what we should teach in schools? And something, Richard, from a former head of GS, so I'm really glad is with us, Vicky Price, talking about are the worries about double counting on well-being, because you're looking at unemployment and mental health. Maybe there are big correlations between the two of those. So,
on education,
yeah.
Obviously, it's of interest to ask what features of a person's childhood best predict whether they will have a satisfying adult life. And you can do that from the British cohort studies, and you find it's not their grades that best predict whether they'll have a happy adult life. It's very simple, replies on a very simple questionnaire, age 16, predict a happy adult life, questions about happiness and so on in childhood, rather than grades. So schools, if they really want to produce a happy population, have got to be addressing the well-being of children in a far more serious way. It's got to be an explicit goal. Gus, you and I have argued that we won't get it taken as a serious goal unless it's measured, because otherwise there's nothing to put in the scale against the exam results. So let's have it, the well-being of the children measured in schools. But then, of course, we've got to give them materials to improve the well-being of the children. It's partly a matter of the whole school ethos, but it's also a matter of teaching life skills in a fully professional way. And we've been involved in developing curricula using really well evidence-based materials, which if you train the teachers to use them, have transformational effects on children. So we need to get that 1 hour life skills lesson per week firmly established in every school. And it's got to be taught by teachers who've been trained to do it. So it needs to become a proper subject in the PGCE. Every primary school teacher needs to be trained in it. And we will have different schools and we'll have happier children and happier adults.
Thank you, Richard. Another question's come in, which might be for both of you, in the sense of worries about how we value life. Because if you're making these sorts of assessments in terms of trade-offs, somewhere in there's a value of a well-being year, as Richard mentioned, but also the National Institute of Clinical Excellence uses quality adjusted life years, which tend to be much lower figures than you get from other systems, and certainly from the sorts of ones that Richard, in the paper that he authored, and I was co-author on looking at the well-being approach to exit, we ended up with very large numbers. We use very large numbers. Obviously, there's no single answer to this, but do you think this is something that we need to have a grown-up conversation about? I've spoken to politicians behind closed doors about these sorts of issues, and they'll never talk about them publicly, because their only public answer is, well, a value of a life's infinite, and you can't go say anything other than that, which we all know is not a way you can actually allocate public spending. I'm afraid we have to make choices and we have to make trade-offs. Have you found that difficult, Carol, getting those sorts of conversations at all?
I think it is. I mean, as an economist, you're allowed to have those conversations more than other people, I think, because that's what people think economists do. They go around, allocating values to things, and then they weigh them up much. So I think it's easier for economists, but I think for most people, this is a very difficult conversation, and is one that we need more of. I mean, the current crisis is definitely a trade-off, or not a trade-off, but has exposed the fact that we're spending an awful lot of our capital treating certain groups of people with very bad impacts for other groups of people. So those trade-offs become very clear. Then how you value those trade-offs, I think there are a number of ways to do that. And clearly, when you commented on NICE's own value of life is low, and it's low internationally, even not worrying about weighting it for well-being or anything else. It is low, and that's partly it's low because one of NICE's roles is as a gatekeeper into what can be used in a cash-constrained NHS system. So it's a little circular, I think, to say NICE's is low. NICE's is low because that's, in a sense, the job of NICE.
Can I comment on that?
Certainly, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you do the well-being approach, you don't have to sort of explicitly think about the value of life. You think about well-being and you think about death, and they both happen to come up in the same numbers, and income's one of the things that affects well-being. So there's an implicit value of life in there, but you don't think about it explicitly. If you are nice, you have to think about it explicitly, because you've got a limited amount of money. It's been rationed. and you should use it in the way that produces the most well-being per pound spent. And that seems to be the situation at the moment, that the NHS is so strictly rationed that they have to apply a rather severe test per QALY. However, what's interesting is if you take the NICE test per QALY and you ask yourself, what would have been the equivalent cost to the nation of having no lockdown and having 200,000 people dying, it's something like 1% of GDP. And so to avoid a cost of 1% of GDP in deaths, we're in fact having a lockdown which is going to cost us 15% minimum of GDP. So if you were a politician who accepted the NICE valuation, you would never have had the lockdown. This shows us that actually people at the political level too really think health is more important than is reflected in the amount of money they give to it.
And I guess the logical conclusion of that is we're just not allocating enough money towards health. I mean,
Yep.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yep.
And I would argue from that the one thing that I would say is I said health. I didn't say doctors and hospitals and nurses. What I mean by health is improving the health of the nation, which is, to my mind, as much about prevention, as much about the right behavioral messages on exercise and the like. And it's about all of those factors, about the social care system. You know, it's not shiny new hospitals and doctors. It's actually finding a way to keep people as far as possible away from hospitals, which has always been my objective in life. Anyway, we've got time for one final quick question. Someone said, who could be the Greta Thunberg of social science? So if you have any ideas who could come out of this as the key person who could lead us into the future, you know, someone who's, dare I say it, slightly younger than we are, who might lead the way.
I think I'd now put a plug in. I'm going to put a plug in as president of the Royal Economic Society, that one of the things we've been trying to do is encourage people who are young to take up economics. There's very low participation from certain, so in economics, economics undergraduates are dominated by men and dominated by people who've gone to private school. And we really would like to have more people going into economics who are more diverse, more women, and those who come from state schools. It's the numbers are quite shocking, and that's where I think our Greta Thunberg is going to come from. She probably is going to come from the non-traditional economics intake, and we really need to work on making economics exciting for that group of people so that they choose it at university and then get the kind of skills that allow them to lead a resurgence in economics, or a resurgence in alternate ways of thinking in economics.
And they need to role models like you, Carol, to push them through.
Old.
So, Richard, you've got to make economics attractive to everybody, not just boys from public school. So, as a state school boy, I'm completely with that, but I'm probably the wrong gender for this. Do you have any ideas, Richard?
No, you wanted a name. I was going to nominate a youngish person called Michael Plant, who's had the guts. He's a philosopher. He's had the guts to set up an organisation to help the third sector evaluate priorities in terms of well-being per pound spent, and that's a pretty good thing to be doing. I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a pop star, or we haven't found the right pop star, have we yet?
Okay, well, on that note, all I would say is I hope Pro Bono Economics can help all of the charities who are listening in today to actually work on improving their offer, helping them through this really difficult period. And if they want to get in touch about how they might measure well-being and use it to prove their effectiveness and to enhance their effectiveness, we'd be very happy to talk to them. But it's now, our time is up, I fear. Just for me to say a big thank you to Carol and to Richard. I'm sorry for all those people listening that I couldn't get through all of your questions, but the fact that there were so many shows that it was of great interest to you. Thank you, Jon, for coming in, showing us that it can be practically done. And thank you, Pro Bono Economics, for organizing this. And stay safe.